You walk into the pasta sauce aisle thinking this should be one of the easiest decisions in the store. It is tomatoes, herbs, maybe garlic, maybe olive oil, maybe onions. That is the mental picture. Something red, slow-simmered, familiar, comforting, and simple. And that is exactly why this aisle gets away with so much. Because the branding is doing half the eating for you before you even touch the jar. Words like traditional, old world, home style, basil, rustic, premium, garden, hearty, deep red labels, Tuscan fonts, farmhouse kitchens, a spoon lifting glossy sauce over pasta like somebody's grandmother has been standing over the stove for 3 hours. But when you stop shopping by front label and start shopping by ingredient logic, the whole shelf changes. Some of these jars are built around real tomato substance. Others are built around a cheaper formula that starts with diluted paste, leans on sugar, oil, flavor systems, or vague shortcuts, and then borrows trust from the category itself. That is the trap. You think you are choosing the smarter, more wholesome, more natural option, when in a lot of cases you are just paying for the feeling of that choice. So today, imagine we are walking that aisle together, from the cheapest comfort buys to the jars that want to look premium, and then over to the sauces that actually make a stronger case on the back label. Not because every inexpensive sauce is automatically bad, and not because every expensive one is automatically honest, but because pasta sauce is one of the clearest examples of how grocery confidence can be manufactured. We are going to look at 5 brands to leave behind if your goal is a sauce built around real tomato integrity, and 5 that actually give you a more tomato-first formula. And the point is bigger than pasta sauce. Once you see the pattern here, you start seeing it all over the store. Start with the way most people really shop this aisle. It is usually not leisurely. It is after work. You need dinner to be easy. You are buying around muscle memory. Maybe one hand is on the cart. Maybe a kid is asking for garlic bread. Maybe you are also comparing pasta shapes and trying not to forget Parmesan. In that moment, the front of the jar becomes a shortcut. You are not studying ingredient hierarchy. You are scanning for emotional safety. You want a label that says, in effect, this is normal, this is reliable, this is what pasta sauce is supposed to be. And the first place that habit often lands is right in front of the big national jars that have been in kitchens forever. The first one I would avoid, if what you want is a sauce that feels more like it started with tomatoes instead of being constructed into sauce later, is Prego Traditional. This is one of those jars that wins on familiarity before it says a single honest thing about how it is built. The label feels dependable. The name Traditional suggests continuity. The color is rich. The texture in the jar looks thick enough to read as hearty. But then you turn it around and the logic shifts. The ingredient base starts with tomato puree, which in this case is water and tomato paste, followed by diced tomatoes in tomato juice, and then sugar, canola oil, and a small cluster of flavoring ingredients. That matters because it tells you what kind of sauce you are really buying. Not a simple cooked-down tomato foundation, but a reassembled sauce where concentrated tomato paste and added water do a lot of the heavy lifting. Does that make it inedible? No. Does it make it fraudulent? No. But does it match the warm, almost homemade confidence the front label sells? Not really. It is a formula designed for consistency and broad appeal, and that is different from a sauce that actually begins with a more straightforward tomato base. And here is why that distinction matters in the bowl. Paste-based sauces often give you a kind of controlled thickness that can read as satisfying at first, but the flavor can flatten out in a way that feels more engineered than naturally developed. The sauce coats well, yes, it clings, but it does not always open up the way a cleaner tomato sauce does, where you get brightness first, then sweetness from the fruit itself, then herbs, then oil, then savoriness. With a more constructed sauce, those notes can feel lined up instead of layered. If you grew up with it, that flavor profile can taste normal. That is how grocery memory works. But normal and tomato forward are not the same thing. A few feet over is another jar that gets bought for almost the exact same reason, and that is Ragu Old World Style Traditional. Even the name is doing theater. Old World Style. It sounds rooted. It sounds inherited. It sounds like there is a village somewhere involved in this, but look closer and the shelf story breaks. This sauce starts with tomato puree made from water and tomato paste, and then you see soybean oil, salt, sugar, dehydrated onions, extra virgin olive oil, spices, and natural flavors. This is where the aisle starts telling on itself. When a sauce trades heavily on old-world identity but relies on a paste plus water base and supplemental flavor construction, you are not buying tradition. You are buying a memory of tradition, translated into mass-market economics. The jar is not really asking, what is the cleanest way to turn tomatoes into sauce? It is asking, what is the most scalable way to create a stable, recognizable version of sauce that most people will accept on instinct? Pause on that for a second, because this is where the category stops feeling random. Once you notice that the big trust words are often paired with the same underlying formula logic, the aisle gets easier to read. You stop thinking in terms of brand personality and start thinking in terms of ingredient architecture. What is carrying the sauce? Whole tomatoes, crushed tomatoes, plum tomatoes, or water, paste, sugar, oils, and flavor support? That one question immediately narrows the field. Now keep moving, because the next jar people grab is not even pretending to be upscale. It wins by price, convenience, and a sort of old pantry reliability, and that is Hunt's Traditional. If you are moving fast, this one can feel almost refreshingly honest because it looks basic. No fancy storytelling, no imported fantasy, just red sauce in a can or simple container, and the familiar recognition that this has been around forever. But when you read what is actually there, this is where the compromise becomes hard to ignore. The base is tomato puree made from water and tomato paste, and then more water, and then less than 2% additions that can include high fructose corn syrup, carrot fiber, salt, sugar, flavoring elements. And this is the moment a lot of people realize that what they thought was a straightforward pantry tomato sauce is actually much more of a processed grocery formula than the packaging mood suggests. The issue is not that every additive is scandalous. The issue is what the product is prioritizing. Once more water, syrup systems, and texture support start entering the conversation, you are farther away from the simple shopper assumption of crushed tomatoes simmered with aromatics. And that gap between assumption and reality is where the real consumer lesson lives. The front of the package says pasta sauce. Your brain fills in the rest. That is why this matters. Most people are not trying to buy luxury. They are just trying to buy actual tomato sauce without needing a decoder ring. Then you hit a different part of the shelf, and this is where the illusion gets more subtle, because now the jars start looking narrower, darker, more boutique, more restaurant adjacent. This is where a lot of shoppers assume quality has gone up just because the design got more serious. One example is Classico Tomato and Basil. The branding sounds specific. Tomato and basil is a classic flavor profile. The jar shape itself has that old preserved jar signal that whispers heritage and care. But the ingredient panel brings you right back to the same category trick. Tomato puree made from water and tomato paste is still doing the main work, followed by diced tomatoes in juice, and then a small supporting cast that can include onions, salt, olive oil, basil, garlic, spices, natural flavor. On paper, that may still look fine to plenty of people, and to be fair, it is not the most compromised jar on the shelf. But if the question is whether the sauce is built from a strong, recognizable whole tomato foundation, the answer is still softer than the packaging implies. And that is important because premium illusion is not only about bad ingredients. Sometimes it is about the distance between the emotional image and the actual ingredient structure. A jar can avoid the loudest red flags and still not be what the buyer thinks it is. That is why label literacy matters more than shelf aesthetics. The nicer jar is not automatically the cleaner jar. The Italian-sounding name is not automatically the more tomato-driven jar. The basil sketch on the label is not evidence of ingredient integrity. In this aisle, visuals can easily outrun substance. The fifth one I would leave behind for this specific mission is Bertolli Traditional Marinara. And again, the point is not that this jar has no place in anyone's kitchen. People buy it because it is accessible, familiar, and often on promotion. But if the title promise here is real tomatoes versus more assembled sauce, Bertolli still lands on the side of compromise. The ingredient list centers on tomato puree from water and tomato paste, with diced tomatoes, onions, olive oil, sugar, garlic, salt, parsley, basil, oregano, spices. On the surface, that sounds respectable, and compared with some lower-tier formulas, it is certainly more restrained. But the pattern is the same. You are still looking at a sauce whose identity is supported by a reconstructed tomato base rather than clearly anchored in whole or plum tomatoes up front. At this point, some viewers are probably thinking, hold on, are you saying every paste-based sauce is trash? No, that is not the argument. Tomato paste itself is not the villain. It has a legitimate place in cooking. A lot of good home sauces use a small amount of paste to deepen flavor. The issue is what the product is fundamentally built on, and how honestly that aligns with the expectation being sold. If the jar sells rustic tomato simplicity while relying on a more industrial architecture, that is a trust gap. And once you understand that gap, you can decide if the convenience and price are worth it to you. Maybe they are, but at least now you are choosing with clear eyes. This is also the midpoint where a lot of shoppers make the wrong conclusion. They hear all this and decide the solution must be to buy the most expensive jar on the shelf. Not necessarily. Price can buy better ingredients, but it can also buy better storytelling. What you want is not a luxury tax. What you want is a better decision rule. Look for sauces that start with identifiable tomato forms you would actually cook with yourself. Whole peeled tomatoes, plum tomatoes, crushed tomatoes, maybe a tomato puree that is clearly part of a tomato-heavy formula rather than watered paste doing all the work. Then check what joins them. Olive oil instead of cheaper filler oils. Onions, garlic, basil, salt, herbs. Maybe carrots, celery, black pepper. A short list is not magic by itself, but a coherent list tells a much more believable story. So now let's move to the other side of the experience. Same aisle. Same decision pressure. But these are the jars that do a more convincing job of saying, yes, this really is about tomatoes first. The first better option is Rao's Marinara. And this one is a useful lesson because it is one of the few mainstream premium jars that actually makes the back label feel as strong as the front. The ingredient list is straightforward. Italian whole peeled tomatoes, olive oil, onions, salt, garlic, basil, black pepper, oregano. That is the kind of lineup that immediately changes the trust dynamic. You can picture it. You do not need to mentally reverse engineer the formula. The tomatoes are whole peeled tomatoes, not a water and paste reconstruction pretending to be old-world simplicity. The fat source is olive oil. The aromatics are recognizable. The seasoning list stays disciplined. And that does not mean Rao's is perfect for every shopper. It is expensive. For a family going through multiple jars a week, that cost matters. But if the question is whether the sauce is built around real tomato substance, Rao's earns its place. What you notice with a sauce like that is not just ingredient purity on paper, it is the way the whole product behaves. The sauce often looks less artificially uniform. It has that slightly looser, more natural movement in the jar. The tomato flavor tends to arrive with more dimension instead of immediate sweetness and density. It tastes like the tomatoes got to stay tomatoes for longer before the industrial system got involved. That is a different kind of satisfaction. Next is Victoria Marinara, often recognized through the white linen line. This is one of those jars that rewards the shopper who bothers to flip it around. Imported Italian tomatoes, onions, olive oil, salt, garlic, basil. Some versions add a few processing support ingredients, but the overall story remains tight and believable. Victoria's bigger selling point is not hype, it is that the label logic feels clean. It is not trying to distract you with 10 emotional cues at once. It is saying the sauce starts with tomatoes and a small set of familiar cooking ingredients. That is exactly what many people thought they were buying all along when they reached for the mainstream jars. In other words, it closes the gap between expectation and formula. And that may be the most underrated feeling in grocery shopping today: relief. Relief when the back label does not make the front label feel like fiction. Relief when the premium price, if there is one, actually corresponds to something more than branding polish. Relief when you do not need a paragraph of explanation to justify why the sauce tastes more like a tomato product and less like a shelf-stable system. Third is Moody Marinara, And this is where the category gets interesting, because Moody has built a reputation around tomato identity itself. Their marinara uses chopped tomatoes and tomato puree, along with onion, olive oil, garlic, sea salt, basil, black pepper, oregano. The key here is not that every word sounds fancy. It is that the brand is clearly centering tomato material in a way that makes sense. Chopped tomatoes, tomato puree, aromatics, herbs, olive oil. This is the kind of ingredient structure that feels closer to actual sauce-making logic than the mass-market jars we talked about earlier. If you want something that lands in that middle zone between everyday usability and ingredient seriousness, Moody is a strong example. And here is a practical note a lot of shoppers need to hear. Cleaner tomato-first sauces are not always thicker, darker, or sweeter than the jars people are used to. Sometimes they taste brighter. Sometimes they even feel a little less heavy at first spoonful. That is not a flaw. That may simply be what happens when the sauce relies less on concentrated construction and more on the tomatoes carrying their own weight. If you are used to a paste-dominant profile, real tomato flavor can actually seem quieter for about 10 seconds. Then it opens. Fourth is Carbone Marinara. Yes, it is more premium. Yes, the branding knows exactly what it is doing. But unlike some upscale jars that turn out to be style first, this one still makes a compelling ingredient case. Italian tomatoes, including whole peeled tomatoes and tomato puree, then onions, olive oil, sea salt, basil, garlic, oregano. Again, you can follow the sauce from ingredient list to kitchen logic without hitting a wall of filler or reconstruction. This is a jar where the image and the formula are at least speaking the same language. You are paying more, but you are not paying only for mood. And that is a major distinction in this aisle. If you have bought premium sauce before and thought, I do not really get why this costs more, products like Carbone help explain the answer. Sometimes it is not about complexity. It is about subtraction. Fewer crutches, fewer workarounds, fewer ways of stretching the tomato concept into a shelf strategy. More dependence on the quality and handling of the tomatoes themselves. That is harder to fake. The fifth better option is Mezzetta Family Recipes Marinara. This one deserves attention because it does something a lot of shoppers claim to want but do not always know how to find. It tells a simpler ingredient story without feeling austere or performative about it. California plum tomatoes, imported olive oil, fresh onions, sea salt, fresh garlic, fresh basil, black pepper, spices. Some versions also emphasize plum tomatoes from Italy's San Marzano region alongside California tomatoes, depending on the product line. Either way, the important thing is that tomatoes are not being treated as a flavor base rebuilt from concentrate and water. They are presented as the actual foundation. That puts Mezzetta in the category of sauces that make more sensory sense as soon as you read them. And now step back from the shelf for a second, because this is the moment the whole aisle snaps into focus. The real divide is not expensive versus cheap. It is tomato-led versus formula-led. The weaker sauces are usually asking, how do we create a stable, familiar, broadly appealing red sauce at scale? The stronger ones are asking, how do we preserve a more recognizable relationship between tomatoes and the final jar? That one difference shows up in the ingredient list, in the taste, in the texture, and even in how honest the product feels once you know what you are looking at. There is also a value lesson here, and it is not as simple as saying buy the premium jar every time. If your budget is tight, the smartest move may not be grabbing the most expensive sauce. It may be buying a simpler canned tomato product and seasoning it yourself, or reserving a better jar for the nights when sauce is the star instead of just a quick utility ingredient. Sometimes the best consumer decision is not brand loyalty. It is understanding when convenience is worth paying for and when it is not. A heavily marketed mid-tier jar can be the worst value in the aisle if it charges you for identity while giving you a formula that is still built like the cheaper competition. And if you have been buying some of the avoid list for years, this is not about shaming that habit. Grocery choices are built around time, memory, budget, and family routine. A lot of these brands become household defaults because they are everywhere, they are predictable, and they have been normalized across generations. But familiarity can hide compromise better than almost anything else in food retail. Once a taste becomes standard in a family, nobody stops to ask what made that standard in the first place. Was it really the best option, or was it just the option that got there first and stayed on sale? That is why the better shopping habit coming out of this aisle is so simple. Ignore the romance words for a minute. Turn the jar around. Read the first 3 ingredients. If you see water and tomato paste doing the main work, understand that you are likely buying a more engineered sauce. If you see whole peeled tomatoes, plum tomatoes, chopped tomatoes, crushed tomatoes, olive oil, onions, garlic, herbs, you are probably in a more tomato-forward lane. Then look for the rest of the support system. Is sugar doing unnecessary image repair? Are cheaper oils showing up early? Are vague flavoring terms doing work the tomatoes should have done themselves? You do not need perfection. You just need coherence. And coherence is what most people are really after, even if they never say it that way. They want the product to make sense. They want the label to match the food. They want the category promise to hold up under one honest look. That is the deeper reason videos like this matter. It is not about acting outraged over a pasta jar. It is about recognizing how often grocery confidence is manufactured through design, naming, and routine, while the actual ingredient logic tells a different story. So if we land this clearly, the 5 I would leave on the shelf, if your goal is real tomato-first sauce, are Prego Traditional, Ragu Old World Style Traditional, Hunt's Traditional, Classico Tomato and Basil, and Bertolli Traditional Marinara. Not because they are forbidden, not because they are the worst foods in the store, but because they rely more heavily on reconstructed tomato bases or broader formula support than their branding suggests. And the 5 that make a better case for actual tomato substance are Rao's Marinara, Victoria Marinara, Moody Marinara, Carbone Marinara, and Mezzetta Family Recipes Marinara. Those are the jars that do a stronger job of saying what they are and being what they say. The larger takeaway is the one I want you to remember the next time you are standing in that aisle, under bright store lights with 10 seconds to decide. A red label is not a tomato standard. Italian-looking branding is not proof. The words traditional and home style are not ingredients. The smartest shopper in the aisle is not the one who recognizes the most brand names. It is the one who can tell when the sauce starts with tomatoes and when it starts with a workaround. If you want, drop the brand that is in your kitchen right now, and whether you still think it earns its spot after hearing this. And if there is another grocery aisle where the front label and the back label tell 2 completely different stories, say that too, because that is probably where we go next.